Hi, welcome to Real Progressives MMT Mondays. I'm Jeff Ginter, your host. Tonight, we're returning to one of my favorites, Professor Bill Mitchell from Australia. He's going to give us, again, it's a relatively short conversation he's having, and he's talking about a variety of different things, how he came to MMT, how he came to understand these things. But mostly, what I love about this one is his discussion of buffer stocks and how that relates to employment. I'm not going to bother to explain it to you here. I'm going to let Bill, in his eloquent fashion, explain that to you. We'll be back after that.
Hello, I'm here with Bill Mitchell, who is a professor of economics at the University of Newcastle. Bill, it's great to have you with me this morning.
My pleasure.
Full disclosure, Bill is a friend of mine, and I would consider him an intellectual mentor, so this won't be exactly the tough Mike Wallace type 60 minutes type of questions. But I wanted you on because you are considered one of the leading proponents of so-called modern monetary theory. In fact, I believe that you even coined the name, and it seems to have caught on in the blogosphere. Do you want to just outline some of the basic principles for the audience?
Well, modern monetary theory is a collection of ideas. It starts off with what I call the basic rules of macroeconomics that seem to have been lost in more modern, starting with the monetarists and then the more extreme versions of what I now call sort of orthodox economics.
And in what sense has it lost sight of basic macroeconomic principles?
Well, we seem to forget that spending equals income. For every dollar spent, it's somebody's income. And we seem to forget that if you don't spend, you won't have income, and that the basic things that we're interested in, such as prosperity, employment, and these things, they're intrinsically linked to spending. And so we have these far-fetched ideas now coming out of the orthodoxy of so-called fiscal contraction expansions. This weird idea that you'll actually get an expansion in the economy if you cut spending, and that just violates what I call the basic rule.
And of course that's been evident in places, Europe has been the most vivid illustration, but you saw it in Japan in the mid-1990s when they introduced higher taxes.
1997 we saw it. The story rewrites itself. We saw it in the 1930s. And then we saw it in 1997 in Japan. The pressure the government does the responsible thing and expands its net spending. It means it spends more than the economic activity generates back in taxes. And then the Conservatives mount their campaign against that because intrinsically they hate the idea of government involvement in the economy unless it's serving their special interests and delivering what economists call rents to them. But so the pressure mounted, and Japanese government in 1997, increased the sales tax, and the economy, which started growing quite nicely again, and bringing down that little nudge up in unemployment, it went backwards again. It took them 5 years to recover. So we've seen this, and we're seeing it in Europe, as you say.
And it seems to be driven by this idea of so-called fiscal sustainability, that there is a level of public debt beyond which you can't go. And at that stage, governments become bankrupt. Now, that may be the case in countries such as in the Eurozone where they don't issue their own currency, but clearly what you would describe as a sovereign issuing currency country, that type of fiscal sustainability argument doesn't apply.
Yeah, a basic starting point for modern monetary theory is that a government that issues its own currency, that has its own central bank, so it controls monetary policy, setting of interest rates, and doesn't sell any debt in a foreign currency, it can never go broke. The idea that it can never run out of money, we've seen these dramatic statements. The US president a few years ago said the US is running out of money. In my country, the budget's just coming up and the Treasurer is saying we have run out of money. Well, that's impossible. A government of that persuasion with those characteristics can never run out of money. And that's juxtaposed, as you say, against, say, Greece or Germany, who surrendered their currency sovereignty and gave it to the European Central Bank. And they can run out of money because they've gone back to the old pre-1971 fixed exchange rate system where they have to cover their spending beyond tax revenue with sale of debt, and so the bond markets can retaliate against that sort of government.
And in fact, it goes back to, when you talk about basic macroeconomic principles and fiscal sustainability, a lot of this goes back to what I would describe as gold standard type thinking, because it's obviously predicated on a notion, an old gold standard, which we used to have, which did actually limit the stock of money that we had, even in countries which issued their own currency until the 1930s, for example.
Yeah, because they tied the currency to another commodity, gold, and so they accepted voluntary rules where they would have these rigid relationships between the amount of their own currency on issue and the stock of gold that their central bank had at any point in time, and so that was a voluntary constraint. And under that system of voluntary constraints, what followed then was that if it wanted to expand spending, the volume of money was linked to the stock of gold, so the only way the government could expand spending if it reduced the spending of the private sector.
Now, the argument that one often hears now is, okay, we've got fiat currencies, there is therefore no external constraint, so what's to stop the government from printing money and turning us into Weimar Germany or Zimbabwe? You've written extensively about that and pointed out some very important differences, I think.
Yeah, I think, there's a number of what I call myths that are layered on top of each other that appeal to people's intuition or the popularisation of history, if you like, which is not the same thing as an understanding of history. And so there's these myths that are used to perpetuate this ideological dislike for government intervention and government action in the economy, but they're paraded out as intrinsic truths that are facts. And the printing money myth is one of those. And if you really understand what happened, say in the Weimar era, as part of after the Treaty of Versailles and the rest of it, if you understand what happened in Zimbabwe, you'll immediately appreciate that. In Zimbabwe, for example, probably for good reason, Mugabe wanted to honour and reward the soldiers that led to the break with the British. But he went about it a very silly way by basically undermining the supply capacity of the economy, which was essentially the farming sector, and destroyed, in a very short time, about 60% of your production capacity. Well, of course, if you keep spending and you can't produce goods to meet that spending, you'll get inflation. If you keep spending on top of that, you'll get hyperinflation. But that's such a weird circumstance.
And you had a similar situation in Weimar, of course. With the you had about 25% of the industrial capacity of Germany destroyed when the French occupied the Ruhr Valley, for example. And that's on top of the fact that you had a devastating war which probably destroyed another part of their productive capacity. Yeah. And then in addition to that, they were being forced to make payments in reparations in gold.
Yeah, I mean, the Treaty of Versailles made ridiculous demands on them in nominal terms in the amount of money they had to give to the Allies. So they were forced by the treaty to expand the money supply out of any proportionality with the supply capacity of their economy. That's a major point. And the second major point is, the steel production was devastated, and so they lost their supply capacity. And whenever we see hyperinflations, we typically see something extreme like that. And that's not remotely like a situation of a government like the US or the Australian government picking up unused capacity in the economy, unemployment, and firms without enough sales on their books, and increasing the spending, and via the central bank basically ratifying that spending by crediting the bank accounts, and that's perfectly reasonable approach.
And I want to go back to something you were mentioning about the gold standard before
just to finish that.
Sure.
What that then leads to, once you accept the fact that if there is idle capacity that can be brought back into production, and the government spends, well then what that leads to is the conclusion as, well, why do they issue debt? And an important part of modern monetary theory is that it basically dispels the myth that what we now have identified as a sovereign government, a currency issuing government, should issue debt. the issuing of debt to the private bond markets is what I call just corporate welfare. And it's most ironic. I mean, it basically gives them a risk-free asset to hedge their uncertainty and store up their uncertainty in a safe asset. And
and creates wealth for the private sector.
Well, it alters the portfolio of the private sector. It gives them
some income. Effectively, it's like offering them a savings deposit as opposed to a flat.
It's exactly that, and a guaranteed income flow, an annuity each year. And the bond market, the big wigs in the bond market are those that often lead the charge in the public debate about the need for so-called structural reform, and that is to eliminate unemployment, reduce unemployment benefits or income support for the most disadvantaged citizens. Yet they're sitting on a welfare pool supplied by a federal government of a greater proportion, many factors of the amount that gets given out in income support to low income groups. So it's sort of an irony. But what modern monetary theory emphasises is that debt is not necessary to support the government spending.
In fact, spending does not crowd out private sector spending. Arguably, it crowds in private sector spending because, as you say, you've got a gap in the private sector savings. The private sector, maybe because of uncertainty, economic uncertainty, or because sales are not particularly robust, has a predisposition to save. And if someone else doesn't step in to offset that, then there is this output gap.
Yeah, it comes back to your initial mention of the concept of fiscal sustainability. We've become obsessed with these financial ratios of deficit to GDP ratios or outstanding debt to GDP. And we somehow we've defined various reference values, as they call them, in the Stability and Growth Pact in Europe. And we've had characters, professors of economics who can not handle a spreadsheet coming out as authorities, defining these values. But those values are irrelevant to a currency issuing government. What a currency issuing government, the concept of fiscal sustainability for such a government is it gets back to what fiscal policy is about. And fiscal policy should be about reducing that idle capacity that you've been talking about, and so advancing what I call public purpose or well-being of the society, and that's defined in a number of ways. But it'll come down to provision of public service, provision of enough spending to ensure there's enough employment, and provision of public infrastructure. Now, as long as the spending is buying those things, then it can't crowd out private spending. Whereas once it gets to the point where there are no things left to buy, then you get a point of much more competition emerging.
And that's an important issue because I think there's a common caricature to people who oppose MMT. They suggest that you are totally insensitive to these inflationary concerns. But what you are suggesting is that there are constraints. They're not financial constraints, but they are real resource constraints.
They're real constraints. Of course, look, all spending carries an inflation risk. It's not just government spending, it's net revenue from your external sector, so your trade account. If that's in surplus, that can have an inflation risk. Government spending can have an inflation risk, and so can private consumption and investment spending. All spending carries an inflation risk, and the concept of what are the limits on a government's fiscal position, and I don't use the word budget because the budget is about households, and the government isn't a household. So the government's fiscal position is limited by what it can buy. A currency issuing government can buy whatever's for sale in its own currency at any time. Now that's not the same thing as saying it should do that, but it can. And so the question is, well, how much should the government net spend above its tax revenue? And that depends upon what's available for sale and what the state of the private sector spending is.
Now I want to go back to a point you were making about the gold standard before, and you mentioned the buffer stock. You have a very interesting idea that you've advocated for a number of years now, the so-called job guarantee program. Other people have called it government as employer of last resort. But it turns the idea of a gold stock buffer into something different. You use employment effectively, or employed people or unemployed people as a buffer stock. Do you want to explain that a little bit further? Sure.
It goes back for me to 1978. I was sitting in an agricultural economics class in my fourth year at Melbourne University, and Australia at that time had a wool price stabilisation scheme, and this was a sop to the very powerful rural lobby, and rural lobbies are powerful everywhere, and no place more than in Europe, for example, which is a lot of the problem. And the scheme worked by to provide a guaranteed income to wool providers, so that the fluctuations of the wool cycle wouldn't damage their annual incomes.
So the government would step in and support the price of wool at a certain point.
They'd agree at what price they would support, and if the harvest was very good in 1 year, if the crop what did they call them? The clip was very good 1 year, and the market was flooded with wool. Well, then the government would buy all that wool, and because that would stabilise the price and
stabilise the incomes of the farmers.
Yeah, the income of farmers would be stabilised, and around Australian cities there were these big red brick buildings everywhere. With big warehouses, and they were the wool stores. And we used to go by in the car and say, and our parents would say, "That's the wool store." And of course, when the clip was poor, and the government would sell the stuff out of their wool stores
to prevent some kind of inflationary
and
shock.
so to stabilise the price. And at that time, I wasn't very interested in wool, but. Unemployment was starting to rise in the late 70s in Australia. The Australian government, like most of the Western governments, handled the first oil price shock very poorly, and unemployment rose from its full employment level for the first time. It's never got back there, but at that time I was more concerned. That was the reason I was studying economics, because I was concerned about unemployment. And I thought, well, this is a full employment of wool scheme, this price stabilisation scheme. It made sure that all wool would always be demanded. And of course, a bit of lateral thinking then says that, well, the government can do that with employment, so that if there's too much labour without a job, that is unemployment, the government can buy all that stock up and at a fixed price.
In effect, maintaining a stockpile of quote-unquote shovel-ready labour that can be drawn back into the private sector as the private sector transitions back.
Well, we've probably gone beyond shovels now in 2014, but a pool of labour, the government can buy it, and when the private sector resumes its strength after a downturn, then because it's been at a fixed price, and you would set the price at the bottom of the private sector wage structure, so you don't interfere with that, the private sector can then buy that labour back any time it wants, if it offers the right terms and conditions. And that overcomes a whole series of problems. Unemployment is the worst evil or cost, or whatever word you want to use, that we can think of. The modern economist is obsessed with what we call microeconomic inefficiencies. Structural reforms is all about minuscule little improvements in transport systems and what have you, but the daily cost of unemployment dwarfs all of those things. And I remember there was a quote from James Tobin, if I recall correctly. He said, "How many Harburger triangles," which for non-economists is this little measure in a graph of the microeconomic inefficiency, how many of them can you fit into an Oaken gap, which was named after Oaken, and that was the sort of loss of output per percentage rise in unemployment? And the answer, of course, is heaps. And so it addresses that problem that workers are never in a non-productive situation. And one of the problems of unemployment, of course, is that workers lose slowly but surely they become dislocated, and they start losing their general skills and also their specific skills. And so these sort of job guarantee schemes stops all of that happening, provides steady income support, and most importantly, it fixes the minimum amount that the deficit has to rise by when there's a downturn to stimulate employment. It sets a boundary, because when do you know that the government's has spent enough? When the last worker has walked into the job guarantee office to pick up a job.
Yeah, and the point is, the argument is, well, we don't want to give people free lunches, and of course what I've always said about the job guarantee is, no, we want people to be able to pay for their lunches, and that's what the job guarantee actually does. So.
Well, look, if you think about what we tolerate now, So let's go to Greece. We've got 60% of the 15 to 24-year-olds unemployed. That's your future generation of workers. They've now been unemployed, for some of them probably for 6 or 7 years already. We've got unemployment rates all around the world of, into double digits. In Europe, it's 10.8 or something at the moment percent. That's a drastic waste of human potential. Even if you take a hard line and just worry about sort of economic things, income losses, that's a dramatic daily loss of income that could be produced. And then if you add the things that psychologists and health professionals and sociologists worry about, and that is mental health and family breakdown and alcohol and substance abuse and all of the other pathologies that are the personal and family and community pathologies that are outside just the loss of income. It's a dramatic loss. So any system that was different to that would, it doesn't take a genius to invent a system that would be better than that. Mm-hmm. And, for people who want to hang on to that system as if it's the Tina, there's no alternative, that's just untrue. Even if all of these job guaranteed workers just turned up in the morning, dug a hole through the day, and an engineer could calibrate how long it would dig and then how long it would take to fill in again. Even if they just did that, it would be better than the system we've got now. But, our research has shown that there's a multitude of productive activities that can be done by that workforce that would be oriented to meeting unmet community and environmental care needs. And so it's not just a matter of digging holes and filling them in again, the old sort of boondoggles.
It's a matter of political will, actually. And one hopes that eventually that the governments will see the wisdom of that approach.
I mean, one of the things that modern monetary theory emphasises, at least the way I talk about it, which reflects my background and where I came into economics, is that the government always chooses the unemployment rate. I do work in less developed countries as a development economist, and I'm always being met by bureaucrats and IMF type officials who start off the meeting saying that unemployment, this is a highly complex, multi-layered, deep problem. And I say, no, it's not. The government chooses the unemployment rate. You could employ all those people within about a week.
Hopefully, more and more governments will start to see the wisdom of that insight. Bill, we've run out of time, but again, thanks very much for taking the time to speak to me today. Really appreciate it.
Hi, welcome back. So what did you think? Let us know in the comments. Email us if you have any specific questions. So again, he's talking about buffer stocks. He's talking about the government regulating the price of goods and services that they consider to be essential. In this particular case, he's talking about the cost of wool. If you have wool that has a great harvest, I think he calls it a clip, and you have tons of wool, well then suddenly, the cost goes down. And if you don't have a very good clip, then suddenly the cost goes up. The point being is that this is an essential item, and the price just keeps going up and down, up and down, up and down. And that has huge macroeconomic effects, for good and for bad, mostly for bad. So the federal government steps in. When they have great clips, when they have great yields, the federal government buys up all the extra. They first set a price. This is what the cost of wool is going to be. And we will buy up all the excess wool to make sure that, because of supply and demand, that price is what you get. And when you have bad yields, we will sell back some of that wool that we previously purchased to make sure that you still get the same price. Why can't we do that for employment? As Bill Mitchell said, that's full employment for wool. That's a very important resource. But is labor not the most important resource that we have? Why can't we do that for employment? Why can't we have a federal job guarantee? Well, that's a lot to think about. And I hope you have conversations circulating around this. Talk with your representatives about this. They always talk about jobs, 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 jobs. They'll bend over backwards trying to make sure that they're going to do whatever is necessary to create jobs, except to create them directly. But it's not the private sector's responsibility to hire everyone that wants a job. It's just not. So the government has to. Back next week.